Good morning.
And I noticed that.
Once again, Father Nicholas has placed copies of the notes for all of the lectures on the lectern at the behind the seating, and there's another pile of them here on the front row. They're not different from the ones I gave out last week. It'll be the same set for all of the lectures. Last week, I opened with quite a few generalities about the conditions existing in the Eastern Roman Empire as Christianity was born and spread. And we talked about the lack of central authority. Obviously, Christianity did not become the imperial religion of Rome for another 350 years. And it wasn't even a majority religion any place it was practiced. I described some of the potential sources that would lead toward a creed, again in about 300 years, and some of the ideas that might tend Christians toward a unity. Obviously, geography played a key role in how you believed at that time. Today I'm going to focus at first on some of the ideas that were prevalent in Second Temple Judaism. It's Roman 2 in the notes that you have before you, that carried over into Christian belief and practice. And I will make a couple of, an overall comment first, and that was we've gone through, obviously, several major periods of time when Judaism has had either a lesser or greater impact on Christianity. At first, it had an enormous impact, and then, thanks to the influence of Paul and ultimately the Romans, Judaism became less and less important in the ideas of Christianity until the Protestant Reformation, when it was virtually obliterated from Protestant Christianity and was actively persecuted and condemned by Roman Catholicism. And it was only about 50 or 60 years ago that Christians began to think about Judeo-Christian unity, and the notions of ecumenism began to be used in our society. And we began, once again, to look at the basic Jewish foundations that survived into Christianity, not so much to give them credit as to help us to understand how we came to be where we are today. Of course, unlike the Christians, in the first century, the Jews had a Bible, the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible had probably been in most of its existence, most of its current form, since the Babylonian captivity, and that would have been about 600 years before the time of Christ. The last 7 books of the Hebrew Bible, which were originally written in Greek, not Hebrew, were added to the Hebrew Testament in between the 2nd and 1st century before Christ. And so the Hebrew Bible, as we know it today, existed at the time of Christ, and recent archaeological finds of scrolls and parchments have demonstrated to us that the Hebrew Bible that is used today is about 99.9% identical to what it would have been at the time of Jesus. Very, very unlike the story we will later tell about the Christian New Testament, which went through many iterations. And so the Hebrew Bible was frozen by the time of Christ. Essentially, the Hebrew Bible falls into 4 major categories. Now, I'm sure most of you are aware of this, but I'll quickly run through it. The first 5 books are the Torah, the creation stories, the Exodus stories, and then 3 books of rules and regulations that dealt with daily life in minute detail. Not only did they have the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, but they had over 700 rules as to how each aspect of your life could be run. Torah, incidentally, in Hebrew means the law, and it's essentially the law of the Hebrew people. The second set of materials that we find in the Hebrew Bible are the histories of the Israeli people, roughly from the time of the founding of Israel after the Exodus, as Moses looked on from the mountaintop and watched his people move into the Promised Land, until roughly the time of about 100 to 200 years after the Babylonian captivity. Most historians today indicate that the histories contained in the Hebrew Bible are highly suspect, and that they were essentially designed to prove points and to make clear the purpose of the Hebrew people, rather than to accurately represent what actually happened. The third major section of the Hebrew Bible is the one that we are probably most familiar with because we use it so often in our liturgies, and those are the works of the prophets, the major and minor prophets. There is somewhat of a misnomer because when we commonly use the word prophet today, we tend to treat that word as synonymous with fortune teller. And Christians for hundreds of years have mined the prophetic works for one principal purpose, and that is to show that the prophets were predicting the arrival of Jesus of Nazareth as the Messiah. And they subverted and changed a lot of what was going on. In fact, the prophetic works were, for the most part, calls by holy men that the Israeli people would return to a worship of Yahweh and to reject the gods of their neighbors. And then they were also commentaries on the times, suggesting that the wealthy and authoritarian class over the Hebrew people was extracting too much from the economy, and as a consequence, the people were starving and would ultimately revolt. And so the prophets are seen as arbiters of the times and warning the upper class that if they take too much for themselves, they will ultimately result in the destruction of the Israeli people. A very, very different notion of prophecy than the notion of just being a foretelling. And then, of course, the last series of books in the Hebrew Bible, incidentally, books which Martin Luther rejected and did not place in his Old Testament. And this is the so-called wisdom literature, the literature that was first written in Greek in the 1st and 2nd centuries before the time of Christ. And these books essentially reflect the initial clash between the Semitic ideas of the Jews, the nomads, the shepherds, the agrarian class, and their Hellenist conquerors after the time of Alexander the Great. And so the Jews became, particularly the intelligentsia among the Jews, began to be trained in Greek philosophy, and they began to reread a lot of the thoughts they had, their Semitic thoughts, in Hellenist terms. And those 7 books attempt to draw some similarities between the Hebrew ideas of how to live and the Hellenist ideas. I think it's important for us to remember, however, that the book we call Old Testament, which of course Jews call the Hebrew Bible, one and the same, is under Christian creed the Word of God. That in the 4th century, when the Christian Bible came into being in mostly its present form, in Greek and then ultimately in Latin, the Hebrew Bible was accepted as the Word of God and became the first of the 2 Testaments. And so Christians accept the fact that the Hebrew Bible is in fact the Word of God. Although many will immediately take the next step and say, yeah, but it didn't finish the story. But as a consequence of that, some of the concepts that are contained in the Old Testament are definitely carried forward into Christian practice. Of course, we heard this morning about the notion of sacrifice. Sacrifice and high priest were both critical concepts in Judaism right through the Second Temple period. The last high priest served in 70, about 35 to 38 years after the resurrection. There was no high priest after 70 because, of course, there was no temple in Jerusalem. The temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70. And at that time, most historians believe that in diaspora, Jewish communities began to look to Pharisees as rabbis. In the earlier period, Pharisees, of course, I've mentioned previously that Judaism was very, very sectarian. There were many, many different kinds of Jews at the time of Christ. Perhaps the most devout of all Jews, however, those who most carefully adhered to the rules of the Torah, were the Pharisees. And they were sometimes feared, sometimes hated, sometimes reviled, but almost always respected because of the fervor with which they attempted to adhere to the rules of the Torah. It seems that after the destruction of the Second Temple, as the Pharisees moved into areas outside of Jerusalem, of course, virtually all of the intelligentsia of Israel, and by intelligentsia I mean those who were well-educated, those who had money, the merchant class, the authoritarian class, were all exiled and moved to various cities around the Roman Empire. And in most of those cases, they moved into ghettos and formed synagogues, and it was very, very often the case that a Pharisee became the rabbi of one or more of those synagogues. And as a consequence, the ideas of the Pharisee became the ideas that were adopted by that synagogue. The role of the high priest was lost. And it was quite interesting that it wasn't until really the beginning of the 2nd century that Christians began to look upon, as we heard this morning in the book of the letter to the Hebrews, look upon Jesus as the new high priest of Christianity. That was probably a notion that came into being around 110, 120. And as a consequence, Christians began to study the role of the high priest and began to attribute the attributes of a high priest to Jesus of Nazareth, to the Messiah. There's a social phenomenon which has been noted by really, quite literally, dozens of sociologists. And that is that when a people as a group are uprooted from their homes and emigrate or are exiled, they tend in their new location to become very conservative, and they tend to reach back into their past for the cultic practices that they used in the past as a solace as a foundation for forming a new life in a new location. That, of course, happened to the Jews throughout the Roman Empire. As they were thrown out of or left Israel, they landed in Antioch, Alexandria, Rome, etc., Ephesus. They lived in ghettos together and began to practice the cultic rules of the Torah. However, we note that some of those rules began to morph over time, and Judaism today represents a great deal of the changes that have occurred through that acculturation. Let me take a number of the concepts that Christians have adopted from Judaism. First of all, Judaism was not monolithic. It was sectarian. And as a consequence, we look around ourselves and we realize how diverse Christianity is in the world today. There was a lack of central authority within Judaism. The high priest, incidentally, was responsible for sacrifice in the temple, but he was not a doctrinal leader of the Jewish people. He did not proclaim from the temple steps the rules for Judaism. He didn't interpret the Torah. That was left to individual rabbis in small communities, and as a consequence, there was a great deal of change. Unfortunately, there was also a great deal of corruption, and after the time of the Maccabees, the high priest was typically appointed by the local Roman governor, and payments were involved in that appointment, and the payments had to be recovered in some way, and as a consequence, the high priest institutionalized and commercialized the notion of sacrifice in the temple, and all of us know the stories from the gospel of Jesus overturning the money changers' tables in the temple precincts. That was representative of the kind of commercialization of sacrifice that was true by the time of Jesus of Nazareth. The prices were rising higher and higher, and the lower members of society couldn't afford to sacrifice because they couldn't buy the official sacrificial material using the official inflated currency of the temple. And so the notion of sacrifice was becoming very, very rarefied by that time. But the notion of sacrifice, that is, that human beings give up something of value to themselves, perhaps even themselves, in repentance for sin. That notion is a fundamental idea adopted by Christianity. The Gospels certainly show us that Christians love allegory as much as the Jews did. And as a consequence, many of the stories that we see in the Old Testament are retold by Jesus and recounted in the Gospels. And that is an important concept because it basically means that one of the underlying books that we use as one of the foundations of our religion is subject to interpretation. Because the story that's told is not a story of what happened or what we think happened, but rather a story about morality or what could happen or that can be interpreted in many, many different ways. Of course, the Jews as a group never really believed that they knew God. In fact, they refused to speak the name of God. They even, when they wrote the name Yahweh, wrote it in a mysterious YHWH way so as to suggest that they were not actually using the name of God in their writings. The Jews understood that they would never fully understand who God was. I think Christians are coming to that conclusion as well. But they were sure that there was only one. And that notion, of course, that monotheistic notion, was adopted by Christianity. The God of Abraham is the God of Christianity, and in fact, the God of Islam, as well as the God of Judaism. The Jews added another concept about God, which is really, I think, which underlies most of the notion of Christian prayer. And that is the notion that God can be a personal God, that you and I can talk to God. And in the case of Abraham, we can make deals with him. In the words of a political candidate whose name I won't use, God is a transactional God. And we can say, you know, God, I'll do this if you'll do this. That notion is a very, very Judaic notion. The notion that you can talk to God and that you can make promises. The notion of life after death that Christians adhere to is a Judaic concept. Of course, it wasn't original with the Jews. The Egyptians, of course, had believed in it. In fact, most anthropologists today have suggested that virtually all people of the world have come to some sort of a notion of life after death. The principal difference seems to be whether or not this life after death is spiritual or corporeal. And by corporeal, we mean a life of the body after death. Historians have tried for years to determine where the Jews got that idea. The Egyptian notion of life after death is not corporeal. It is spiritual. And so they didn't get it during the Exodus. They may have gotten the notions of monotheism from one of the pharaohs, but they certainly didn't get the notion of a corporeal afterlife. The only extant materials that the Jews may have learned about came from the Persian religion of about 800 to 1000 BC. And it seems that the Persians invented angels and bodily life after death. And of course, the Jewish scholars would have been familiar with those notions. It wasn't without controversy. Among the Jews, for example, the Sadducees did not believe in a corporeal life after death, but the Pharisees did. And they became the leaders of the Jews, and they became actually the intelligentsia of Judaism that the Christian thinkers came in touch with. So the notion of a life of the body and the soul after death was inherited from Judaism. Okay, I am now going to turn to the early history of Christianity in your notes. Obviously, Jesus was a Jew, and the earliest followers of Jesus were in fact called followers of the way. The name Christianity or Christian seems to have been used first right around 70 to 75 AD, and it seems to have been used first in the Christian community in Antioch, in present-day Syria. Incidentally, Antioch does not exist today. It's a city like Ephesus that was a port city, and the river silted up, and once it was 5 or 6 miles from the Mediterranean coast, it began to lose importance, and it fell into into disarray. There was a massive earthquake at the end of the first century, and another about a century after that. And today, Antioch is in ruins, and you wouldn't want to go there anyway. It's in the middle of the Syrian war right now. And so Christians began, I'm going to start using the word Christian now because that's appropriate for the period. Christians began to ask themselves, as I said before, if Jesus was God, how do you square that with the notion of monotheism? If there is a God the Father and a God the Son, that's two gods. And so thinkers began to try to determine how that could come about. I will tell you, Christians argued that issue for the next 650 years, coming to different conclusions each time. Trinitarian notions, for example, came about 100 years later. For a long, long time, there were discussions that Jesus, as the Son of God, was a lesser God, that God the Father was God, and the Son, if you think about it, in normal parlance, when you talk about a father and his son, you naturally assume that the Father is superior to the Son. And so the very use of the words Father and Son to describe the Creator God and Jesus of Nazareth automatically gives you a mindset that there's an up-down relationship between the two of them. And that, of course, troubled the very, very early Christians. Incidentally, for the Jews, they did not expect that the Messiah was going to be God. The Messiah was going to be a great prophet sent by Yahweh or Elohim to rescue the Hebrew people from their sinfulness and from the oppression of the Greeks and the Romans. And so calling him Messiah did not automatically convey Godhead to Jesus. The Gospels began to come into existence, really among the first written materials that Christians had, in the middle of the first century. We think that the first gospel to appear was probably the Gospel of Mark. And it was probably either taken from the preaching of Peter, or it may even have been dictated by Peter. There are various theories as to who Mark or John Mark, the evangelist, was. We have a few clues in the gospel itself. There's a great deal of military language, and the author of the gospel clearly understood military tactics and military structure. And so some have concluded that perhaps there was a Roman soldier who was educated, who converted to Christianity, became a secretary to Peter, and wrote the gospel based on Peter's sermons. The second gospel to come into existence was Matthew, probably in Antioch, probably 10 or 15 years after the Gospel of Mark. Luke came around at about the same time. Most historians now believe that the person who wrote the Gospel of Luke had medical training. Obviously, there's a lot of discussion of medicine in that gospel. The diction of the Gospel of Luke is identical to the diction of the Acts of the Apostles, and therefore many scholars now refer to the Acts of the Apostles as Luke 2. And the familiarity of the author Luke with the life and times of Paul have suggested that Luke was somehow associated with Paul, perhaps even as a companion on one of his journeys. At any rate, the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, each in, incidentally, several different forms, began to circulate in the 60s and 70s, maybe the 80s. And then finally, the Gospel of John appeared. probably close to 100. Some say as early as 85, but others think it may be as late as 100. Some have suggested, because of the language in John, that it was written by a community of believers among the Samaritans. The attractiveness of the Samaritan people, who were hated by the Jews as enemies, the attractiveness of the Samaritans appears only in John's Gospel, not in the other three. If we place the Gospels in the order in which we think they were now written, and that's been done mostly by examining the language that was used and how language changes over time, we don't have a lot of things written for Christianity. But boy, the Romans and the Greeks were incredible authors. There are quite literally thousands of books, manuscripts mostly, I shouldn't say books, manuscripts written in either Greek or Latin from before the time of Christ and right up through the next 200 or 300 years. And we have pretty good dating as to when those manuscripts were produced. And thanks to the use of computers, we are now able to trace a lot of the language that appears in the Gospels, compare them to similar language in Greek and Roman literature of the time, and conclude certain things about the likely period within which they were written. If we put them in the order in which we think they were written, and read them right through, not just a few paragraphs each Sunday morning, you come away with a couple of very, very important considerations. The first is that you realize that the notion of Son of God, as applied to Jesus, was in development within Christianity during that entire first century. And that by the time of the Gospel of John, the notion that Jesus was divine was a key feature of Christianity. Whereas at the time of when Mark's Gospel was written, 50 years before, it was still very, very much a questionable issue. The second thing that came over which we began to have a very different understanding is the resurrection. Many of you may be aware of the fact that there is a great controversy over whether or not the last chapter of Mark, which includes the description of the resurrection, was in the original gospel, as to whether or not the first gospel even mentioned the resurrection. The earliest copies of the Gospel of Mark that we have do not contain that chapter. Okay? There is an explanation for that, however, and I don't want to make too much of this issue, because it was the last chapter. Keep in mind, these books were not bound. Okay? They were folios of 16 pages that were sewn down the center. And so you ended up with 8 pages that were folded, and that gave you 16, and then the folios would be added one to the other. And so the Gospel of Mark, the earliest Gospels of Mark, you would think would be 32 pages or 2 folios. Okay? Most of them are only 30 pages. And so we may have lost the last page over 2,000 years. And so don't make too much of this issue. Okay? But if you do read the notion, you begin to come, the Gospels in order, you do become, I think, at least questioning, as the early Christians did, as to what the meaning of the resurrection was. And specifically, we're talking about the bodily resurrection of Jesus. There is no question in my mind that within a generation and a half of the death of Jesus, Christians came to believe that Jesus was bodily risen from the dead. No question whatsoever, and it became, of course, ultimately a bedrock feature of the Christian creed. And it would have not been inconsistent with basic Judaic notions. Many of you who've read some of the prophetic works will remember that at the end of his life, Elisha did not die and wasn't buried. A fiery chariot took him to heaven in the Hebrew Bible. I am told that there are two other examples in the Jewish Apocrypha of bodily resurrection. And so that notion wouldn't have been entirely foreign to the Christians. So over 2,000 years, incidentally, the Gospels are not a creed. They are not a creed. You could not take the Gospels and list the rules and regulations and institutions and so forth and come up with Christianity from those Gospels. Christianity, probably, as we know it, came about as a result of, I think, two key events that occurred, one almost immediately after the death of Christ, and one several hundred years later. The first, of course, was the notion of Paul in creating communities of believers, what he called house churches. And that was really the first institutionalization of Christianity. And it took hundreds of years as Christianity became the imperial religion of Rome, and ultimately under the tutelage of the Roman emperor who at that time was seated in Constantinople. It became the religion of the empire, and we began to see basilicas built. Incidentally, in the earliest church, there were house churches. These were the churches like the churches that Paul founded, and they were typically in homes and hosted by the owner of the home. And then there were basilicas. The word church really didn't exist as such until much, much later. Basilica is basically a Greek word that means house of the king, or the castle of the king. And the first churches were built as basilicas, cruciform, facing east, with a domed center. Some of the domes were pretty rudimentary, but many of those basilicas are now being unearthed, and dating back to the 2nd and 3rd century, often have beautiful mosaics, paintings on the walls, et cetera, et cetera. And so the Christians moved from house churches to basilicas. Very impressive buildings. I think the Gospels, because there are 4 of them, are probably the best evidence that the followers, later called Christians, held very different ideas about who Jesus was. But there are 2 general areas in which there is incredible similarity in the 4 Gospels. The first, of course, was that the essential message of Jesus was a message of love, charity, forgiveness, and what now is being referred to as the preferential option for the poor and the oppressed. All 4 of the Gospels make that point over and over and over again. It is probably the easiest way to understand everything that Jesus talked about. From that, we get, of course, notions of both social justice and charity. And the other outstanding similarity among the 4 is a virtual verbatim description of the Passion. If you read all 4 of the Passion accounts together, you will find that while there are minor details that are pointed out in one and not another, the overall story of the Passion is astonishingly identical. In these 4 volumes, written by 4 different people, 4 groups of people, in 4 different parts of the world, over a period of 60 or 70 years. That very, very strongly suggests that one of the essential parts of early Christianity was the idea of the Passion, and that troubadours or preachers or wandering minstrels or whatever else you want to call them, that moved from community to community and earned their keep by telling stories about Jesus, had virtually the identical story of the Passion. And it gives you a really, I think, a really, really solid foundation of evidence where so many things dating from that period are in question and being questioned every day by scholars and others. And we see a general loss of Christian belief in the world. I find that this very notion of the identity of both the notion of charity and love and the Passion, on the other hand, to be really an astonishing testament to the fact that it really happened just like that. And I get great comfort from that. When you go back to school at my age and start studying these things, you once again experience the kinds of questioning that we had when we were, or I had when I was 18 or 19 or 20 and was in a secular college and meeting new ideas for the first time. And then finally settled into a family life and a Christian existence among friends who really never questioned those issues again. But then as an adult, when you go back and begin to look at these things again, you're looking for any straw that can underlie what has been your faith. And as Augustine described it, it's faith-seeking reason or faith-seeking understanding. And I find these two facts, the similarity of the gospel on Jesus' preaching on charity and the identity of the descriptions of the Passion, to be something you can really grab and hold on to and say, yeah, there it is, I'm right. Okay, I will pick up with Paul next week. Thank you.